Hello and welcome to TransForm Tuesday. I'm Dave McCormick, VP of Products and Services here at Alpha Software, and I am joined today by Sarah Mitchell, in charge of our documentation department. So today, let me scroll down here, we are going to be talking about ETL, extract, transform, and load. Basically, what we're going to be talking about today is how to replicate the data that you have in the Alpha Transform Cloud into a SQL database. And we'll be talking about why you would want to do that and how you go about doing that and what's involved. So generally speaking, you can access the data, of course, from the Alpha Transform using the API. But I'd like to introduce a scenario that's a little bit more complex than maybe the typical implementation, or actually might be a typical implementation, and that would be something like our field services solution that we are working on right now here at Alpha. So with the field services solution, what we want to offer is a web portal that's different than the Transform Central portal. And in this web portal for Transform Central, we want to be able to do things like show graphs and show key performance indicators and run reports and a lot more. And so we could conceivably just do that using the API. So why would we want to do ETL instead? Well, if you've used the Alpha Transform API, you know there's limits in terms of what you can query. You can query what we call the top level fields. Those are the metadata fields that go along with a form. For example, who it's assigned to, when the form was created, when it was last updated, form ID, and a few other fields. But you can't query the underlying data. So that makes it a very slow process. That means each time you want to, for example, put together a graph or a chart, you're going to need to bring down all of that data into the API. Now, there are ways of getting around that using some user-defined fields, but another reason you'd probably want to do this is because it could be quicker. Alpha Transform is up on the cloud, but you may have a dashboard that is running not in the same data center. You may have something that's running on-premise, for example. And if you keep the database on the same server as your, or in the same location as your application, you're going to have no network latency associated with that. On top of that, querying a SQL database is faster than querying Transform because Transform API first has to interpret your request and then do a SQL backend call in the background to get the data back out to you. So that's an extra step having to go through an API. It's quicker to go right through a SQL database. And then the other reason you want to do it is because there'll be less programming involved. Using API calls, while we do have a builder in Alpha Anywhere, which makes it considerably easier to build out API calls with the, it is still coding versus things SQL querying, which is basically SQL, which is a very mature technology. A lot of people, you probably already know how to work with it if you're a developer. And it's just a much easier platform to use SQL as opposed to doing programming. So how do you go about getting the data from Transform into your SQL database? So how do you make sure that this is kept up to date? Well, one way to do it is using the built-in define on submit action. You might be familiar with this. You find this on the home screen of the Alpha Transform web portal. And the two examples that we show here on the screen when you're in Transform are one is to send an email. So in other words, when a form is submitted, when you're defining the on-submit event, when a form is submitted, it sends an email with the data out to the email addresses that you specify. Another example that we show here, and this is just a screenshot, so I'm sorry I can't scroll down, is one in which you make an API call, which is also another good way to send out the data. But there are a few other on-submit events here that aren't described, but they are in the documentation. And one of which is to actually write directly to a SQL database. So here I am in Alpha Anywhere. Let me just make this a bit bigger. And for those of you who don't know, Alpha Anywhere is our low-code platform, but it includes a bunch of developer tools in the API which are helpful when working with Alpha Transform. So one of the things that you can do using the TransForm on Submit Genie is you can send things to a database, and it actually walks you through the process, and it creates all of the JSON that you need to go back and paste into the on submit action here on this page. So that sounds ideal, but it has some limitations. And one of the limitations is that if it is unable to connect to your database for some reason, maybe there is a network issue, maybe the database was pulled down for a moment for maintenance, whatever, it's only going to try once to submit that data. So if it can't make it, that data is not going to get submitted to your database, and it does not even notify you that it didn't make it. So as a result, trying to get from here to here, if this gets blocked, you're going to end up with missing records here in SQL. So while this is an okay solution and perfectly fine for testing and will probably work for you fairly well, you may want a more robust solution, which is what we're going to do with the field services application. So next week, I'm going to show you the code that goes into creating the ETL, but today I'm going to talk about the flowchart and what would be involved in doing an ETL between TransForm and SQL. And we'll do that right here. So this is it. Basically, on a regular basis, that might be every minute, might be every 5 minutes, might be every 30 seconds, up to you. It depends on how much processing time you want to commit. You could submit a query to your SQL database. This is your copy of your TransForm data, and find out what the latest timestamp is for the record in your SQL database. Next thing you'll do is do a query using the API, using the TransForm API to find out what the latest timestamp is in the records that are stored in the TransForm cloud. And if they match, well, then you know that your job is done because they're both up to date. But if you find that they don't match, then that means that something has changed in the TransForm API that has not yet been captured in the SQL database. So at that point, what you want to do is then run another API call to get those records, and then a SQL insert and update to take that new and updated data and refresh your SQL database. And next week, we will show you how we went about doing that in code. But before I leave you there hanging, in case you want to start this yourself, I just wanted to point out one quick thing that is available in the TransForm metadata. Here I am in the TransForm API Explorer, which is again part of the Alpha Anywhere IDE. And I happen to have a form for which I knew the form instance ID, and I'd already entered my API key. And so I did a query. And when I did that query, I took a look at the metadata that came back. And you'll see one of those fields is called metadata timestamp. For those of you, Sarah actually pointed that to me, but it's sort of a Unix or Linux standard to use a field like this called timestamp. And what timestamp does is it gets updated every time when the record is first entered, and also when a record has been changed or updated later on. So that is the field that you will be looking at in the metadata to do the comparison back here in the flowchart. So that's it, another short and sweet transform, but I am here to take your questions. If you have any, go ahead and type them into the questions box of the GoToWebinar control panel. And if there are no questions, keep in mind you can always send your questions to tfservice, that's TransForm Service, at alphasoftware.com. And it looks like we are light on questions today, so hopefully you found that useful, and I hope you tune in next week where I show you the code to make this all work. Thanks again for attending TransForm Tuesday. Looks like we're out of questions. Again, send any emails. Send an email to tfservice@alphasoftware.com if you like. All right. Well, hey, thanks everyone for showing up, and we'll see you next Tuesday. Take care and goodbye.